world's oldest and biggest women's prisons in the world. Untold stories of daily life, secrets, and the women within. Women's prisons, shrouded in history and mystery, have long held a unique place in the criminal justice system, while men's prisons have garnered significant attention over the centuries. The world's oldest women's prisons have stories often hidden behind layers of societal taboos, limited documentation, and gender-based prejudices. The day-to-day lives, punishments, routines, escapes, and social dynamics within these prisons create a complex tapestry that reflects both historical injustice and attempts at reform. This deep dive into the world's oldest women's prisons seeks to uncover the secrets, routines, and intricacies of their existence. A brief history of women's prisons. Historically, women found guilty of crimes were often treated differently than men. For centuries, female criminals were considered morally depraved rather than merely criminal, with social stigmas dictating their punishment. The early women's prisons were often makeshift sections within male facilities or separate buildings on the same grounds. The idea that women's criminal tendencies were linked to moral failings meant that their treatment focused on reforming them to be more feminine and pious. 1. Early examples of women's prisons. Some of the earliest women's prisons include the Fleet Prison in London, which had separate quarters for women, and the Saint Lazare Prison in Paris, established in the 17th century. Saint Lazare initially housed female debtors and women accused of petty crimes, but later evolved to include political prisoners, prostitutes, and women suspected of witchcraft. It became notorious for overcrowding, harsh punishments, and rampant disease. 2. Reform movements and dedicated facilities. As reform movements gained momentum in the 19th century, several standalone women's prisons were established. Institutions like the Indiana Women's Prison in the United States and Holloway Prison in England were some of the first dedicated to female inmates, emphasizing rehabilitation over punishment. Yet, these reform-oriented prisons often masked grim realities. Despite their promises of gentler treatment, the conditions were brutal, and the prison regimes were designed to reshape women's characters rather than address systemic issues or provide fair punishment. 2. Daily life, routines, rituals, and the reality of confinement. The day-to-day life within these prisons reveals much about the nature of punishment and reform in different cultures and eras. 1. Morning routine. Most women's prisons in earlier centuries enforced strict, militaristic routines. The day typically began early, sometimes as soon as dawn, with prisoners being woken up by the clanging of metal bars or the ringing of a bell. Guards would perform roll calls and ensure everyone was accounted for. In the colder months, mornings were especially harsh, as heating was limited and prisoners were often provided with only thin blankets and worn clothes. For many prisoners, especially those in cells without adequate ventilation, mornings were filled with the stench of overcrowded quarters and poor sanitation. 2. Breakfast and meals in older women's prisons. Meals were meager and monotonous. Breakfast would usually consist of porridge or bread, often stale and without much nutritional value. In Saint Lazare, reports indicate that food quality was poor, and prisoners sometimes had to rely on food brought in by family members if they were fortunate enough to have visiting privileges. The quality and quantity of food often depended on a prisoner's rank or status within the prison. Inmates with good behavior or those who took on additional duties, such as sewing or cooking, might receive slight improvements in their diet. 3. Work and labor. Labor was a key aspect of prison life. In the Indiana Women's Prison, sewing and knitting were common assignments, believed to teach women feminine skills and instill discipline. Some prisons, especially in the United States, assigned agricultural tasks, with inmates working on nearby farmland. This labor was unpaid, of course, and in many cases, particularly grueling. In some older European prisons, inmates were also made to perform laundry work or prepare meals, contributing to the prison's internal economy. This work, often done under harsh supervision, served as a reminder of their perceived debt to society. 4. Exercise and recreation exercise was minimal and usually restricted to a courtyard area for brief periods each day. Often, these sessions were held under the watchful eyes of guards, who enforced silence and limited interaction. Physical exercise was seen as a privilege rather than a necessity for health. In St. Lazare, women were given some opportunity for outdoor activities, though often this time was reserved for more affluent inmates or those considered less dangerous. In other prisons, exercise time was frequently cut short due to overcrowding or staffing limitations, leaving women confined to their cells for long periods. 5. Rehabilitation efforts and education. In the 19th century, there was an emphasis on moral education. Religious instruction was common, with chaplains and nuns conducting sermons and Bible readings. These activities, however, were often rooted in the belief that women needed to be saved from their sinful natures. Formal education was rare, though some prisons began to introduce basic literacy classes, especially in reform-focused facilities. This was seen as a way to uplift women and prepare them for a virtuous life after release. 3. Prison hierarchy and staff. The prison staff, from wardens to guards, played a significant role in the day-to-day experiences of female inmates. The hierarchy and interactions between staff and prisoners often dictated the levels of brutality, favoritism, or neglect within the prison walls. 1. Roles and responsibilities of staff in the oldest women's prisons. The staff was typically comprised of male officers, with female matrons only introduced as reform movements emphasized the need for women to oversee other women. In St. Lazare, the staff included nuns who served as both caregivers and disciplinarians. Female matrons were tasked with ensuring inmates adhered to strict rules, enforcing silence, and carrying out punishments for disobedience. This gendered staffing was intended to protect female inmates from potential abuse by male guards, though, in many cases, it only added a layer of harsh, religiously motivated oversight. 2. Guard-prisoner relationships. Relationships between guards and prisoners varied widely. Some guards would show small acts of kindness, such as allowing extra food or exercise time, often in exchange for information about other inmates. Conversely, other guards were notorious for cruelty, routinely punishing prisoners for minor infractions, including speaking out of turn or failing to maintain eye contact during inspections. In many cases, these power dynamics fostered an environment of fear and manipulation. IV. Convictions, punishments, and executions. Women convicted and imprisoned in these facilities were typically involved in crimes deemed by society to be particularly scandalous or threatening. 1. Typical convictions. Common convictions included theft, fraud, adultery, prostitution, and even witchcraft. In earlier centuries, female inmates were often treated more harshly than their male counterparts for crimes involving moral offenses. In 18th century Europe, for instance, women accused of promiscuity or infidelity were frequently imprisoned, even if no actual crime had been committed. 2. Capital punishment. Capital punishment was a grim reality for many inmates, particularly those convicted of murder or high treason. In France, women sentenced to death faced public executions by guillotine, a form of punishment designed to serve as a public spectacle and deterrent. In England, executions were less public but equally severe, with hangings carried out in a manner that emphasized societal retribution. V. Escapes and attempts at freedom. Prison escapes were rare but not unheard of, as security measures were often rudimentary in the earliest women's prisons. 1. Notable escape attempts. Despite the heavy security, some women managed to escape through bribery, collusion with sympathetic staff, or, occasionally, sheer audacity. Holloway Prison, for instance, saw a daring escape attempt by suffragettes, who used political influence to garner support for their release, ultimately achieving freedom through public pressure rather than physical escape. 2. Security measures. Security in early prisons relied heavily on physical barriers and guard surveillance. In more modern times, razor wire fences, guard towers, and alarm systems became standard features. But initially, the prisons depended on iron gates, barred windows, and patrols. VI. Visitation and contact with the outside world. Contact with family was minimal and tightly regulated, with most prisons only allowing visitors under strict supervision. 1. Rules of visitation in St. Lazare. Family members could visit, but visits were often brief and monitored closely by staff. Some women were allowed to receive gifts or money, which could be used to improve their conditions slightly. Visits were a luxury, however, as not all prisoners had the means or family support to arrange them. 2. Letters and communication. Written correspondence was often restricted. Many letters sent to prisoners were intercepted and read by the staff, especially if there were concerns about escape plans or contraband. Those prisoners who could read and write were often given limited materials to write home, with censors ensuring nothing incriminating or critical of the prison was included. The world of women's prisons encompasses some large, highly secured facilities that vary significantly in their amenities, treatment of inmates, and management of internal criminal networks. These prisons differ widely, from those known for offering comprehensive rehabilitation programs to others notorious for internal violence, trafficking, and corruption. Here's a look at some of the biggest women's prisons around the world, their facilities, infamous reputations, and unique inmate dynamics. Largest women's prisons and facility ranking. Some of the largest women's prisons include California's Central California Women's Facility, CCWF, which houses over 2,500 inmates, and Tihar Jail in New Delhi, which has a women's wing holding hundreds of female inmates. Other notable large facilities are Brisbane Women's Correctional Centre in Australia and the Julia Unveiler Prison for Women in Alabama, USA. In terms of facilities, Scandinavian prisons are frequently ranked among the best globally, with Halden Prison in Norway considered particularly humane. Although Halden is primarily a men's prison, its facilities set a standard for Norway's approach to incarceration, which emphasizes comfort, rehabilitation, and reintegration. Japan's Tochigi Women's Prison is another high-ranking facility that prioritizes rehabilitation through educational programs and skill training. Denmark's women's prisons also offer more humane treatment, focusing on allowing inmates a sense of community and family contact. In contrast, Tihar Jail in India is notorious for overcrowding, which makes rehabilitation programs difficult, and there are frequent reports of internal gangs. Despite efforts to control violence, notorious prisons for sex trafficking, drug trade, and inmate mafias. In some women's prisons, internal criminal networks involving drugs and trafficking persist despite strict security. Brazil's Anísio Jobim prison complex and certain women's sections in Mexican prisons have become hubs for drug cartels. Prisons in Latin America are often overcrowded and under-resourced, leading to minimal supervision and allowing gangs and drug cartels to operate freely. Reports of trafficking within certain U.S. prisons also surface, with instances of staff corruption and abuse of inmates making headlines in recent years. In many of these facilities, inmate hierarchies and mafia-like organizations have taken root. Women with ties to gangs or organized crime often assume positions of power within these prisons, sometimes controlling access to resources, deciding punishments, or exploiting other inmates through trafficking and extortion. Capital punishment and execution protocols. Capital punishment for women remains rare but is carried out in certain countries like China, Iran, and the United States. In these cases, women sentenced to death typically face lethal injection, hanging, or, in some nations, firing squads. In the United States, capital punishment is applied based on state laws, with lethal injection being the most common method. In prisons where women face the death sentence, like in Texas, executions are conducted after long appeals processes, and the procedure is strictly monitored. Work opportunities and earning potential. In many women's prisons, inmates can participate in work programs to earn minimal wages, which can be used to support their families or save for life post-release. These jobs range from crafting and sewing to laundry services and even call center work in some U.S. facilities. Prisons like the one in Tochigi, Japan, allow inmates to work in agriculture and handicrafts, creating products that are sold to help them earn money. This income, while minimal, often provides a small sense of independence and purpose for women inmates and helps support their children or family members on the outside. Parole and release practices. The process of parole and release varies by country and prison system. In many Western countries, life sentences can often be reduced based on good behavior, and inmates may become eligible for parole after serving a certain percentage of their sentence. For instance, in the United States, parole eligibility varies but typically applies after a prisoner has served a minimum number of years, often around 15 to 20 years for a life sentence. In Norway, where sentences are generally capped at 21 years, early release is common if the inmate demonstrates positive behavior and rehabilitation. In contrast, countries with harsher penal systems may rarely grant parole, and release on parole can be minimal, especially in countries with overcrowded facilities and less lenient policies. Across the board, women in prisons face complex challenges and opportunities, with the differences in conditions often highlighting broader inequalities within criminal justice systems. The size, resources, and management of these facilities reflect the values and limitations of each society's approach to incarceration and rehabilitation. The history of the world's oldest women's prisons is a complex and dark chapter in the criminal justice system. Despite gradual reforms, many early prisons for women were plagued by issues of overcrowding, disease, and harsh punishment. Over time, changes in public perception, coupled with advocacy for prisoners' rights, led to improvements. Yet remnants of the past lingered in many institutions well into the 20th century. The stories from these prisons, of survival, resilience, and, sometimes, rebellion, serve as a stark reminder of the need for a humane and just approach to incarceration, especially for women who faced a unique set of challenges in the prison system.